Well, hello, welcome back. Today we're learning about this. So if you're like me, you're trying to learn JavaScript and you come across this keyword this, and then you think for a long time that you understand how the this keyword works. And then all of a sudden this keyword starts doing weird things and you have no idea why. And then you realize that it's way more complicated than you thought. But then it all sort of clicks into place and it makes perfect sense. And so I wanted to make a video about the this keyword so that it can make perfect sense to you as well. Okay, so just a heads up, I'm going to be assuming a bit of prior knowledge of object-oriented programming. So if you've never heard about that before, this video is probably not going to make that much sense. So with that said, let's jump into it. All right, let's start off with a very simple object literal. Alright, so we have an object called person and it has a property name, Carl, and it has a method introduce that says, hello, I am this name. So what you'll see then is people will write person.introduce, and if we run that, you'll see, hello, I'm Carl. So in this case, this is referring to the person object. And I can prove that by saying person.name is equal to Elliot. And then we do person.introduce. And let's run that. Now you'll see that it returns hello, I'm Elliot. And so before we change the name, it's referencing person.name, which is Carl. And then we changed person.name to Elliot. And now person.introduce returns hello, I'm Elliot. So this is an example of implicit binding. This keyword is implicitly bound to the person object. So let's give a more detailed example of that. Say that we have another copy of this person. We'll call this person 2 and person 1. We'll give this person a name, Elliot. So if we now do person1.introduce and person2.introduce, so when we run this, you'll see that it outputs the same thing. And this is because JavaScript is implicitly figuring out what the this keyword refers to. So in the first instance, the introduce method belongs to the object person1, and therefore this keyword is referencing the person1 object. So in the second instance, the introduce method belongs to person2, and so this.name references person2.name, which is Elliot. So with implicit binding, the this keyword refers to the object that the method belongs to. So an easy way to think about it is look left from the dot. In this case, left to the dot is person1, and in this case, left to the dot is person2. So with that understood, let's go into a more complicated example of this. Let's get rid of person2 and say that person1 has a brother. So now we still have the person1 object, which has a name and an introduce method. And person1 also has a property brother, which is a new object that also has a name and an introduce method. So now we can say person1.introduce and also person1.brother.introduce. And so now if we run this, we get hello, I'm Carl and hello, I'm Peter. And the reason for this is in the first instance, the introduce method belongs to person1 and therefore this refers to person1. And in the second instance, the introduce method belongs to the brother object and therefore this refers to brother. And so brother.name is Peter. So what about if you have a method that doesn't belong to a object in the case of a global function? So let's have a look at that. Let's clean this up quickly, like so, and let's take this introduce method out and place that up here. Okay, so clearly this code is going to return an error, and it does. And it says person1.introduce is not a function. And that makes sense because person1 doesn't have a method called introduce. So instead we could write global introduce, like so. And let's see what that returns. Hello, I'm undefined. So why is this returning undefined? So when we call a function in the global scope, this keyword defaults to referencing the global object. And the reason why global introduce is returning hello, I'm undefined is because it's trying to reference this .name, and global.name is undefined because the global object doesn't have a property name. Alright, so let's try out a similar example here. Let's go back to having introduce as a method on person1. Alright, so now person1 has an introduce method again, as you can see. So say that you wanted a global function that was the same as person1.introduce. So you could do that like this. Alright, so what we're doing here is we are reassigning the function person1.introduce to a global variable global introduce. So if we now run global introduce, you might think that you'd get hello, my name is Carl, but what we get instead is hello, I'm undefined again. And the reason why is because we're actually only copying the function. You can see that if we log out what person1.introduce is, I'll comment this out for a second. You see that this is a function called introduce. So there is actually no reference to person1 anymore. And so we can't implicitly determine what this is referring to. And therefore this defaults back to being the global object. Another way of looking at it is that each object contains key and value pairs. And so for this particular key, introduce, we have a value of this function. So when we assign this function to this global variable, what we're basically doing is just this. So if you look at it this way, hopefully it's much clearer as to why we can't implicitly determine what this is referring to. So an important thing to realize about the this keyword is that it's very context dependent. And so what the this keyword references will change depending on the context that the function or method is called in. And so this is called execution context because the this keyword is defined when the function is executed, not when it is declared. So up until now, JavaScript has been implicitly figuring out what this refers to. So how do we explicitly say what this should refer to? And that's where three different methods come into play: call, apply, and bind. So let's have a look at how those methods work. So in this example, let's get rid of this method introduce. So obviously we can't really do person1.globalintroduce because this will throw an error. It says person1 global introduce is not a function. And that's fair enough because we haven't defined a method called global introduce. We only have a global function. So what if we want to make global introduce act as if it was a method on person1, and in doing so make this reference person1? Well, that's a case where we can use call. So all functions in JavaScript have a call method. So we can just say call like this. And the first argument that you pass into the call method is the object that you want this to reference. So in this case, we want this to reference person1. And so we can just type in person1 in here. And so when we run this now, we get hello, I'm Carl, because this is now referencing person1. And so if we create a new object, then we can go global introduce.call person2. And in this case, we want this to refer to person2. And then if we run this, it will say, hello, I'm Elliot. And so you can see that call is very powerful in that we can explicitly say what the this keyword should be referencing. Now, what happens if our function also has some arguments? So let's put in an age here and an occupation. And then we want to do something with those two arguments. Alright, so in the function, age is referencing this argument and occupation references that argument. So if we now run this, we'll get hello, I'm Carl, I am undefined and am a undefined. And that's because we haven't passed in the two arguments. And so with call, we can pass in our arguments right after the object that this should be referencing. So if we now run this, you'll see that our arguments have successfully been passed into our function. So now let's look at the second method, apply. But we don't really need to change much to our example here because apply works in a very similar way to call. So if we change this here, apply, and so the only change that we need to make is to change these arguments into an array of arguments. And so we can do that by adding square brackets. And now, if we run this, it will output exactly the same thing. So you can see that call and apply work very similarly, it's just how you pass the arguments that is slightly different. So now let's look at the third method called bind. So bind is similar to call and apply, but slightly different at the same time. So let's have a look at what happens when we do bind. Bind takes its arguments just like call does. We'll take out the array and we'll say bind. Now if we run this, nothing is going to happen because nothing outputs. So what is bind actually doing? Well, bind returns a new function that has bound this argument to person 1 and has passed in these arguments already. And so then we can create a new variable like this.
Const and introduce bound to person 1. So that equal to the function.
And so what bind is really doing is, instead of executing this function like call and apply did, it just returns a function that can be executed at a later time. So one thing about bind is that once a function has been bound, it can no longer be unbound. So regardless of what context the function is being called in, what this refers to will always reference what we bound it to. So I'll give an example of that. So if we move this person2 object down to here, we can give it a new method called introduce to person1. And so we're just going to take this function and put it there. And so now person2 has a method called introduce bound to person1. So let's execute that function. So person2 dot introduce bound to person1. Alright, so when we run this now, let's see what happens. We get, hello, I'm Carl, I'm 22 and I'm a developer. So we can see that this is still referring to person 1. Alright, so with all of that out of the way, let's have a look at how this functions in callbacks, because this is an area that a lot of people also get tripped up on. Alright, so to talk about callbacks, let's go back to a simpler example where we had a method on person 1 called introduce.
And we no longer need this global function here. We don't need any of this.
So now we're back to our simple object with a name property and an introduce method. Alright, so now let's create a function with a callback. If you're not familiar, a callback is just a function that gets passed in as an argument and that gets called inside of another function. So let's create a very basic function with a callback. Alright, so this is a function with a callback in its absolute simplest form. You pass in a callable function in here, and then inside that function it gets called. Alright, so now let's have a look at how callbacks can cause some confusion when it comes to the this keyword. And inside here we want person1 to introduce themselves. We can write person1.introduce like so. So we're just passing in the function, and then that function will get called inside of here. And you'd assume that this would work just normally, but you'll see that returns hello, I am undefined. And so to understand why that's happening is let's go look at how we were reassigning a method to a global variable. So what we're doing is basically saying
const global introduce is equal to person1.introduce.
And then we're just passing in global introduce. you'll see that this returns the same result. So if you remember why that caused issues, that should hopefully clarify why this is causing issues. But if that's still not clear, we can look at it another way. So if we copy this function here, and then we paste it down here, and then we pretend to imagine what would happen when we execute it. When we're passing in the introduce function into here, like so, what happens is we're actually passing in this function here. So if we copy this function over here, and then paste it inside of there, that's sort of what's happening when we pass in a function into a callback. And so you can see again, we have no more reference to what this is. And so we're defaulting back to the global object. And because the global object doesn't have a property .name, it returns undefined. Okay, so hopefully now it makes sense why passing in person1.introduce will return hello, I am undefined. So let's have a look at how we can now fix this using bind. So let's get rid of all of this because we do not need it, and have a look at how we can pass in this function using bind. So we start off with our function with a callback. Then all we need to do is say person1.introduce.bind person1. And so what we're doing here is we're passing in this function, and then by calling the method bind on it, we're creating a new bound function where this keyword is referencing person1. So by doing that, we can now run our function and we get hello, I'm Carl. Now the interesting thing is, if we create a copy of this and we say person2, and now we run this, it'll say hello, I'm Elliot. Okay, so just like before, even though that introduce is a method of person1, when we pass it into a callback, we are just passing in this function. And then when we call the method bind on it, we create a new bound function where this keyword is referencing person2. So we've talked about a lot, but we haven't really touched base with the case where you would have probably seen this used for the first time. And that would have been in a constructor function. So let's have a look at constructor functions and how the new keyword affects this keyword. Alright, so finally we can create a person constructor. So what we'll do is we'll do function person, that will take a name, and then we can say this name is equal to name, and this dot introduce is equal to a function, and you'll probably guess what this is going to be. Pretty standard. So what we can now do is create a person instance. So we'll do that quickly. So here we have a new person instance, person1, with the name Carl. So if we now do person1 and we run that, we get hello, I'm Carl. So let's have a look at what's actually happening when we say new person. So I'm going to leave out a few things that the new keyword is doing, specifically setting up prototype chains, because it's not relevant to understanding what is happening with this keyword. So let's say that we wanted to recreate this.
Person2 is equal to a new person, Elliot.
And eventually we're going to want to be able to do person2.introduce like so, and have it say, hello, I'm Elliot. So what's actually happening? Well, firstly, the new keyword creates a new object, person2. So let's start with that. Const person2 is equal to a new empty object. So then we call the person function where we bind this to person2. Let me show you. So we call the person function like so, using call, and we want this keyword to refer to person2. So we pass in person2 here. And then as our arguments, we pass in the name, Elliot, like so. And so now when we execute this, it'll say, hello, I'm Elliot. So we can also go ahead and console log the person2 object. So you can see that our object has been set up correctly. It has the right properties and it has the right methods. So let's quickly break down what actually just happened. So we created a new empty object here. And then this line is what's important. We said person.call person2. So that's essentially executing this function, because remember, this is just a function. Even though we call it a constructor function, it behaves just like any normal function does. And then what we're doing is we're saying we want this to reference person2. So person2.name is equal to the name that we passed in. That makes sense? So that's how we get this. And then person2.introduce is equal to this function. And that's how we get this introduce. And so again, by using the call method, we can explicitly state that for this function, we want this to reference person2. So as I said, there's a few things that we missed out on here. We didn't really set up our prototype chain correctly. And you'll see what I mean when we test that person1 is an instance of person versus if person2 is an instance of person. And so if we run that now, the first one will return true, which is to be expected, and the second one returns false. And the reason why is because we didn't set up our prototype chains correctly. And so that is a perfect segue into the topic for our next video, which will be prototypes. Alright, so I hope that this is making more sense now. But Alright, so that brings us to the end of this video. I hope that the this keyword is making more sense for you now. But if it isn't, feel free to leave any of your questions down in the comments below and I'll be more than happy to answer them. But for now, I'll catch you later. Look, it just keeps going and going and going. And going and going.